Good afternoon. My name is Louisa Delicio and I lead the adaptation team at the Net Zero Commission. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of the Heat Stress Spotlight report, which was released earlier this week. Developing the report has been a project for my team over the past 12 to 18 months. Up front, we want to give a huge thank you to the people who have helped us throughout the process of developing the report, our key partners across New South Wales Government, leaders in this space, including Resilient Sydney, the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils and Sweltering Cities, and countless others, including researchers, practitioners, local councils, and community members. There's already a tremendous amount of work underway in this space, and while the report focuses on the opportunities going forward, we definitely see and acknowledge the work that is already happening. I'd now like to acknowledge country. Today, I'm joining from Darug country on the lands of the Barramatagal people here in Parramatta. The Net Zero Commission acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands and waters on which we live and work throughout New South Wales. We pay respects to elders, past and present, acknowledging the diversity of First Nations people across New South Wales, and we recognise their ongoing connection to land, waters, biodiversity and culture. We recognise the practice of intergenerational care for country and its relevance to our work. The Net Zero Commission values Aboriginal knowledge of caring for country. We seek to listen, learn and build strong partnerships with First Nations people across New South Wales. Moving on to the agenda for today. We have a bit less than an hour and we want to make sure we have some time for questions at the end. So we'll do some introductions kicking off and then we'll cover the process of developing the report. Then we'll go through the report's findings and then we'll get to the Q&A. Thank you to those of you who have already submitted questions to us. You can submit questions at any time into the Q&A function of this meeting. We'll only be taking questions from that function. Please use the chat function if you have any tech issues. I'd now like to welcome our commissioners who will be presenting today, Professor Andy Pitman and Maria Atkinson. Could you please introduce yourselves, Andy and Maria?
Thank you, Louisa. I'm Andy Pitman. I'm a commissioner on the New South Wales Net Zero Commission, and my particular background is physical climate systems and climate science.
Hi everyone, I'm Maria, one of the other independent commissioners, and my background is environmental science. My expertise is industrial, energy, built environment, transport sectors, and we'll talk to you a little bit more about planning later on.
Great, thank you. I'll now move to a quick overview of the Net Zero Commission. The Commission is made up of 7 commissioners, including our chair, Nicholas Rowley, plus the New South Wales Chief Scientist and Engineer as an ex officio member. It's supported by a staffing unit of about 25 people. Commissioners were appointed by the Governor on advice of the Minister for Climate Change for their expertise in key areas such as climate change science, economics, finance, industry, government, technology, First Nations, regional and remote communities in New South Wales, and they were appointed for 5-year terms. The Commission is directly accountable to New South Wales Parliament. We are overseen by the Joint Standing Committee on Net Zero Future. The Climate Change Net Zero Future Act passed both houses of Parliament with cross-party support in December 2023 and is now in force. The Net Zero Commission was established by this Act to provide independent expert advice on the state's progress towards our emissions reduction target to reach net zero by 2050 and the adaptation objective that New South Wales is more resilient to a changing climate. I'll now move on to talking about the Heat Stress Spotlight Report and its development. It was developed through research, engagement, and a lot of stakeholder consultation. The Greater Sydney Heat Smart City Plan really did inform the early thinking that we took to this report, but we wanted to, being a statewide body, really take a statewide perspective to this issue. And as such, we spoke to people across the state, including undertaking a targeted consultation in Dubbo earlier this year. We included some questions about extreme heat and humidity in our first consultation paper that was released in 2025. We received 55 submissions responding to those questions about the preparedness and response to extreme heat events. Overall, the Commission has spoken to over 20 stakeholders individually, as well as holding regional roundtables in the Illawarra and also in Dubbo. The Commission's heard from a wide range of stakeholders across government, local council, industry, and community service providers. I just wanted to touch on, I guess, a definitional element from the report that we use the term extreme heat events much more widely than the definition of heat waves in Australia and the way that they are defined. We know from research that is being undertaken at the University of Sydney that survivability limits of extreme heat and humidity are likely a lot lower than previously thought. Health impacts, including death, also occur on extremely hot days or during events that people might not meet the threshold for a heat wave, which is when extreme heat continues over a 3-day or more period. There are a lot of other factors, including individuals' health and well-being, radiant heat, wind, and physical activity that play a role in determining whether somebody experiences heat stress. Because of this report, the report used extreme heat events to characterize heat waves, broader acute heat events, chronic high heat, and also the impacts of humidity, rather than simply using the term heat waves. I'm now going to hand over to Andy.
Thank you, Louisa, and welcome everybody. It might come as a surprise to some of you listening that heat and humidity is Australia's deadliest disaster. Heat and humidity kills, but it kills invisibly, in contrast to a bushfire, for example, or a flood. The image on this slide shows hospitalizations due to heat in comparison to hospitalizations from other events like bushfires, extreme cold, and rain and storms. And you can see very clearly that there are far more people hospitalized due to heat than are hospitalized due to those other factors. In fact, a 1-degree increase in maximum temperatures can be attributed to a 20% increase in visits to the hospital, putting an immense strain on the state's public health system. Heat risk is broadly under-recognised in policy and planning, and that is one of the things we are trying to address in this report, to raise heat and humidity up to a level where the recording of death and illness associated with heat and humidity, indeed the true burden of heat stress, is properly measured and feeds into policy and resourcing strategies. Next slide, please. So we're already regularly experiencing extreme heat events in New South Wales. This is a snapshot for the 2025-2026 season. There are areas of New South Wales that were experiencing above 30 or 35 days of extreme heat through that season. The evidence around some extreme events is really at the cutting edge of research globally and in New South Wales. But the research around extreme heat is well established. We know for sure that extreme heat events are becoming more common, lasting longer, and occur more intensely than they used to. Indeed, grandparents never experienced some of the heat events that we have observed in the last few years. And again, this is not cutting edge new science. This is extremely well established from the data. This is just the trend in one measure of heat stress, which is known as the wet bulb globe temperature. And that's a bit technical, but it just combines heat stress through the combination of temperature and humidity. So recent summer, January 2026, that heat wave in New South Wales was the hottest since the 2020 black summer. And as many of you know, we look like we're heading into an El Nino, which tends to be associated with extreme heat. So that record heat in the January 2026 was quite remarkable because it wasn't associated with an El Nino. And indeed, that upward trend that you see there, an upward trend in heat stress, is due to climate change and the warming patterns and the changes in humidity that we are observing over New South Wales. And the bad news is there isn't a single climate projection looking forward. There are no climate projections that have been done that don't highlight an increasing risk of extreme temperatures moving into the future. So this isn't a problem that's going to go away without some strategy and planning on our part. Next slide, please. So our understanding of heat stress deeply informed our findings, and heat stress is complicated. It comes from how hot and humid it is, but it also really matters how able you are to adapt. So there are people who don't find events that are hot and humid particularly challenging. But then there are other people, particularly the vulnerable, the elderly and people with underlying health problems, in particular cardiovascular stress, and of course people in low socioeconomic conditions, which include Indigenous communities, are particularly vulnerable and can cope much less effectively with extreme heat and humidity than, for example, people living near the coast, which tends to be ameliorated a little bit from the hot and humid conditions that are being experienced in inland New South Wales. So how exposed are people to heat in their environment is a crucial factor, and these all combine to define different communities, different parts of the state that are vulnerable to heat and humidity. Next slide, please. So we came up with a series of findings, 14, and we're going to quickly go through some of these key findings. The first is about planning. If you think about how we plan for bushfires, and that includes public communication, an individualized bushfire plan, clear understandings, hopefully within your own families, of what you will do if a bushfire breaks out. Would you leave early, or do you have alternative strategies? That kind of planning is something that we would like to see developed for heat and humidity. So a coordinated seasonal heat response plan for the summer months, which promotes early preventative action, health system readiness, and workforce planning to enable us to be more prepared for heat stress. So it's not rocket science. It's clearly communicating that heat and humidity kills, and some preparedness and some thought on how the state and individuals would cope with heat helps build resilience and protects people's lives. Next slide, please. The second finding is about communication. Ensuring the effective communication of declared heat waves in particular when those heat waves are associated with high humidity, is needed to encourage focused action. I have never heard a news service as a cyclone approaches saying, "This is awesome, it's lovely weather." But we do hear that for heat waves. It's going to be a lovely weekend. And that narrative, as we move to increased risk of heat stress, needs to be reconsidered. A severe heat wave is as dangerous as some of the other natural hazards Australia is prone to. And the finding 3 is around public awareness. We're raising the issue that extreme heat and humidity is dangerous. Public awareness and education could be strengthened through a seasonal heat plan that treats heat stress like other natural hazards, builds an understanding of how emergency services could respond, and helps mobilize interagency coordination integrated with locally understood risk and messaging. Next slide, please. One of the things that we think, and it sounds a little contradictory, we've said that heat and humidity kills and is the most serious risk to Australians. And then we say we need to measure this stuff better. And that sort of sounds like, how do we know that heat and humidity is the biggest risk if we're not measuring it? The truth is we are measuring it, but we're not measuring it accurately. Many people who are severely affected by heat and humidity and go into our emergency hospitals will be viewed as having an underlying health condition, and the role of the heat and humidity isn't always recorded, including in mortality events. So good data underpins good decision making, and to understand the scale of heat stress and to build effective action, we would like to see the statistics on the consequences of heat stress events to be measured, to be tracked, collected, and published much more systematically by New South Wales Health. Next slide, please. And I think that's over to you, Maria.
Thanks, Andy. So there's a number of people on the webinar from a planning or a development control local council background, and I'll do my best to go through really the findings that relate to planning, specifically housing, and then also for all of us, our workplaces. So in this finding 5, there's a couple of new terms that I really want people to take note of, both in the glossary and detailed in section 4. You know, we're used to thermal efficiency and thermal comfort as expressions. This heat stress report clearly defines thermal resilience and also thermal safety. And so in our recommendation for 5, we're saying that we've got this opportunity to look at the ways our homes are built, how our community spaces are planned, and design and maintain different spaces so that we can ensure that we have responses to heat stress that are appropriate. And we've decided to break this into 3 tiers of actions in the planning sector to help achieve a reduction in the heat stress through strategic planning reforms, designing for cooler communities. Through our existing state sustainability standards and development controls, there's lots of opportunities to unlock heat stress within existing planning instruments, and then to leverage what is already a well-established urban greening programs. So I would like you to go into the detail in section 4 of the report. It tries to provide information and suggestions for how to improve our planning system to support this overarching thermal resilience. Next slide. Finding 6 is specific to housing. Current policies and regulations, especially for social housing, Aboriginal community housing, and all of the rental housing across New South Wales should be revised to offer sufficient protections to tenants and decrease the vulnerability that Andy has described to heat stress. So introducing stage minimum thermal safety requirements for rentals would be a targeted and high impact policy that we've suggested to address the risks of heat stress. We're focused on vulnerable communities within social and Aboriginal housing, and we've recommended that policies should be strengthened and aligned with new standards. And we believe that these recommendations could facilitate improvements across New South Wales dwellings and really have a focus on the vulnerable tenants that our engagement identify. So next slide really moves us to our workplaces. Obviously, if our homes are not supporting us to rest, to sleep well during extreme heat events, or at times of high humidity, we don't perform at our best at work. But some jobs are particularly high risk, including outdoor workers. So finding 7 is a broad set of recommendations, strengthening the Safe Work New South Wales regulations that will come in mid this year. And so we have suggested improvements that could be made via mandating the development of heat stress prevention plans with prescribed minimum elements to manage heat stress at high-risk industry workplaces. Our picture here is construction workers. It's evident the outdoor working community is very affected. But we've also included guidance on safe heat thresholds, and we recommend that requiring modifications or even stopping work supported by on-site temperature monitoring is relevant. Ensuring broader protections consider the circumstances of independent contractors. And we've also, once again, reinforcing Andy's point that improving data collection on heat-related harm in the workplace is important. We hope that these suggestions would lead to reforms that would reduce preventable health impacts, providing regulatory certainty to businesses that are not only in high-risk industries, but really specifically to minimise the economic losses associated with extreme heat events. The loss of productivity is key. So we'll come back to a couple of questions that we had in advance in relation to the built environment, but I'd like to hand over to Louisa to cover up the last few findings in the report.
Thank you, Maria. Just pause and welcome any questions in the Q&A function from you before I jump into findings 8 and 9. So finding 8 is about heat stress being recognised in existing long-term plans. And essentially in New South Wales, we have 2 plans, one for statewide adaptation, the Adaptation Action Plan, and one for disaster risk reduction, which is the State Disaster Mitigation Plan, which also includes some adaptation-related actions. And our finding here is really that to build long-term resilience to heat stress in New South Wales, we need heat to be explicitly and consistently considered within these plans. And we know that there will be opportunities coming up for the Climate Change Adaptation Action Plan in New South Wales and the State Disaster Mitigation Plan to be refreshed and done anew. And we're taking this opportunity to suggest that heat resilience is embedded as a central whole of government priority. Moving on to finding 9. This is really about local communities and how local communities can plan for heat stress, and really came from a lot of the discussions that we had with local communities in the process of developing this report. The finding is that providing capacity building tools and resourcing to local communities to develop and coordinate locally led responses to heat stress could address existing gaps and account for place-based climates and characteristics. So what we know and what we heard is that local communities are well placed to identify their heat risks and vulnerabilities, and they know what they need to do, essentially, to respond. But a lot of councils and community organisations face capacity and resource constraints that limit their ability to plan and act on heat resilience. So we think that targeted funding, guidance and support from state government would enable councils and communities to lead tailored heat stress planning, improve risk awareness and coordination, and translate state level strategies into effective on the ground action. Now, I just want to touch on some of the case studies in the report at a high level of detail. You can read them in this chapter, but I think it's worth touching on some of the particular stories that we heard and wanted to highlight through the report. I think the Greater Sydney Heat Smart City Plan needs to be acknowledged. It was developed by the Western Sydney Regional Organisation of Councils and Resilience Sydney, collaborating together. The plan acts as a blueprint to mitigate heat risk in Greater Sydney and was created in a collaborative process with over 40 organisations. It contains 6 key directions and 40 recommendations. It's been internationally recognised as best practice for a collaborative and place-based approach to heat adaptation. But we know from the task force that they've struggled to secure government funding and commitments to deliver the actions that are in the plan. This highlights that the persistent barrier to achieving heat adaptation and building resilience at the local level is often that sort of institutional support from state government and funding pathways are often lacking. And that's in a council area that has been able to plan. We know from our consultation, particularly in the Dubbo region, that councils do want to plan for heat, but they are often unable to do so because they don't have the funding or the expertise to plan for it without hiring more staff, which costs money, etc. So we heard a lot of really important messages from our engagement in stakeholders described widespread and growing impacts across Western New South Wales, including power outages, higher energy costs, and the effects on learning environments, on ageing people, and housing and infrastructure, which are increasingly unable to cope with rising temperatures. The visit really highlighted for us the critical role of community-led and locally informed action, while also underscoring that limited funding and resources remain barriers to implementing coordinated preventative heat resilience measures. One of the other stories that we heard was about how the Broken Hill power outage in October 2024 impacted the local community there. So severe storms caused the collapse of transmission towers there, supplying Broken Hill with power. It led to a prolonged power outage, which affected around 12,000 properties during the extreme heat, with temperatures exceeding 40 degrees Celsius. The loss of electricity removed access to air conditioning and other cooling, significantly increased health risks, particularly for older people, children, those with disability and with chronic illness, and disrupted daily life, recovery efforts, and community safety. It highlighted Broken Hill's high vulnerability to compounding climate and infrastructure risks, underscoring the urgent need for targeted regional adaptation, including stronger grid resilience, backup and renewable energy solutions, and accesses to safe, publicly available cooling spaces. So anecdotally from this Broken Hill experience, we really heard that people were relying on private enterprise essentially to provide cooling spaces. So a local shopping centre or a local McDonald's. These were the stories of where the places where people sought refuge because they were unable to do so in other places. And obviously there's no obligation from those organisations to provide that, but also they're not open all the time. So they're not accessible all the time and to those communities. One of the other case studies that we highlighted was about the South Coast Health and Sustainability Alliance. So taking your mind all the way to the other part of the state, down in UN country in the Eurobodalla region. The South Coast Health and Sustainability Alliance is a not-for-profit charity in the Eurobodalla region that is focused on building community resilience and supporting a low-carbon economy. We heard from them that following the 2019-20 bushfires and heat waves, and in the absence of any other support, the organisation independently developed and implemented a heat and smoke haven strategy for the Eurobodalla, establishing a network of upgraded community facilities to support people during extreme events. With disaster-ready funding that they have now secured, the initiative is expanding to 11 havens, and this story demonstrates the importance of locally led actions, volunteer capacity, and collaboration in delivering effective place-based climate adaptation. So moving to the next slide. The take-home messages in very simple 4 dot points is that heat stress is Australia's single biggest threat to life of any natural disaster. Heat risk is getting worse and will only continue to get worse. Unfortunately, there's really no good news there. We know the risks. The risk is understood, and that reducing the risk is possible through adaptation action, including planning and effective communication. And we think through the 9 findings that we've given the New South Wales government. So we're a little ahead of time, which is good news for Q&A. Please provide any additional questions into the chat function. I will go to some of the pre-prepared questions now that people kindly submitted to kick us off. First, I'll throw to you, Andy. We received 2 questions from the Lock the Gate Alliance related to the link between our findings on heat stress in New South Wales, particularly the underestimation of heat-related mortality and decision-making for new high-emitting projects, including Scope 3 considerations. Could you suggest what the underestimation of heat deaths might mean in this context?
Thanks, Louisa. Easy questions first, I see. So there are now methods to attribute climate-related impacts, such as extreme heat, to specific fossil fuel projects. It was published last year by Abram et al. And demonstrated a strong link between individual fossil fuel projects and elevated mortality. Secondly, our coal spotlight report released last year identified that Scope 3 emissions are being insufficiently considered for approvals for coal mining projects. In line with this, currently New South Wales lacks policy guidance for consent authorities' assessment of Scope 3 emissions and their impacts. So if you think of those 2 things together, if we improve how we record illness and mortality and we account for Scope 3 emissions, I think that would lead to positive outcomes. But I would add that we already know that emissions can be directly linked to higher mortality, and this could be one of those areas we don't necessarily need more data.
Great, thank you, Andy, for that. I'll go to Maria on the next question, which we got from Schools Infrastructure New South Wales, asking how New South Wales schools should adapt to heat stress.
Thanks, Louisa. Well, the report made a decision to focus on the strategic planning and households and work environments, But I would like to emphasise for all of those that are on the call from education that we absolutely heard directly of the challenges of teaching, playground supervision, and also student behaviour during extreme heat events, particularly for the children who struggle with what they termed as self-regulation. So there's this physical and physiological social impact of heat stress. It really drives the challenges of learning, wellbeing, safety, risks in schools. So adapting schools to heat stress is critical. It's not directly referred to in our report, but the principles outlined in the report are transferable. Fundamentally ensuring buildings are thermally safe, increasing shade and tree cover. Also, this reducing amplifying surfaces, like the research has shown that asphalt or synthetic turf actually contributes and so are not good. And also this enabling, we heard in Central Western New South Wales, the flexibility that they have to build in during extreme heat events to respond to these hot days. But also schools with air conditioning were respite centres in some locations. So a key point is that the solutions will need to be locally appropriate, and across the state, we just have to build in heat resilience, this thermal resilience and thermal safety, these two phrases that I keep referring to in all infrastructure, but in particular our school infrastructure, and the planning is essential to protect not only the kids and the students, but also the employees, the teachers and employees. Thanks, Louisa.
Thanks, Maria. I might go to you also for the next question that we got in the pre-questions. The question is, what implications do you see for the private sector, and how do companies respond within current regulatory and ESG frameworks?
Well, thanks, Louisa. I was just so buoyed to hear a number of the participants are from the private sector, and we've been talking a lot about recommendations to government, but anyone working in sustainability or risk in the private sector, the extreme heat events is a risk, an appropriate risk to embed into basically climate risk and reviews that are under any business contributes to the New South Wales economy, and so the effect of productivity. But I think the key point is that just about every business in some way will be affected during an extreme heat event, and so therefore anticipating, responding and recovering are key attributes. So every business being exposed, heat doesn't just affect the people, we've been talking about the people, but it severely disrupts supply chains, reduces the productivity of labour. There's also increases in insurance and energy costs, and it undermines asset performance. There's also risk that you've identified on private assets where people seek refuge. So this means that heat should be treated as a material risk, assessed and managed in the same way that other core business risks are treated. And so the recommendation is the private sector shouldn't be waiting. It should be responding, making sure that their risk assessment processes address extreme heat events. And I hope that our Spotlight report gives them enough material to do that.
Great. Thank you, Maria. So I'll go to some of the questions we've gotten now through the Q&A function, and please do add some more. So we've got a question from Chloe Spear about whether the Commission plans to expand this analysis to the impacts of severe heat on the natural environment. So I think the way to answer that is we don't have specific plans right now, just after we've launched this report, but we do know that our work on extreme heat and humidity doesn't end with this report. And though we took the decision to focus on the health impacts of extreme heat in this report, we know that it has far-reaching wider impacts, including on the natural environment. We did hear quite a lot about it in our consultation, particularly in Dubbo. We heard about the heat stress that the animals at Western Plains Zoo experienced. We have also heard about native animals experiencing extreme heat stress and needing to be euthanized in some instances. So we know it's obviously a very significant issue, huge issue as well for agriculture and animals in agriculture. Andy, would you like to add anything to the response to this question?
So first of all, we can attribute some challenges associated with the natural environment to individual fossil fuel projects now. The paper I mentioned by Abram also did that work on coral bleaching events. So that link exists. There's a huge literature on how extreme heat affects individual organisms. And it's well understood. And the question is what you can do about it. Whereas with human heat stress, you can have a conversation or you can design cities to be less vulnerable. It's hard to know how you protect natural ecosystems from extreme heat. And the solution there is, of course, to do our best to minimize the extreme heat events, which goes back to our overarching goal in the New South Wales Net Zero Commission, which is to reduce emissions.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that, Andy. Yeah, and it really is like a very significant part of this work that we weren't able to, unfortunately, go into. I think you'll all appreciate the report is quite a length already, and that was really narrowing the focus. So we do understand that there's a lot of other work that we could do in this space, and we would like to revisit it. I'll go to a question from Luke Walton. Hello, Luke. The question is, I might ask you to comment on this question initially. It is, will the Commission work with planning, councils and others to help them prioritise reforms that will have the biggest and best outcomes? For example, raising thermal performance of new homes above 7 stars might have minimal health benefits, whereby upgrading older homes might have some significant benefits. How do we make sure the government prioritises reforms that are cost effective and meaningful?
It's a very good question. So, Luke, again, I want you to go to the glossary and understand thermal comfort versus thermal efficiency versus what I think we've introduced around thermal resilience and thermal safety. So thermal safety is setting a temperature within an indoor environment that you shouldn't exceed because of human health impacts. More vulnerable people will have more sensitive reaction to that temperature. But we haven't introduced in planning thermal safety in our design codes for new buildings, but also alterations and additions in looking at changes that we should be making in existing buildings. Internationally, we've seen some wonderful examples of innovation in the rental acts. So setting a thermal safety requirement, which is one of our recommendations to look into and address. But in Los Angeles, for example, they introduced through their rental agreements that a place that you are renting, a home, cannot exceed the equivalent of about, I think it's 28 degrees Celsius. And so this means that certain things have to be done to the existing building. So there's a lot of opportunity in the way we design new buildings, and we need to consider this extreme heat events as occurring. It is going to happen more often, and therefore focusing on the way we design our streets, what we put in our buildings, how we design for passive design within our buildings is key. But then there's a lot of information we need to make accessible to people who are within their homes of what they need to also do in existing homes. So I think that those two things are very important, not just focusing, as we often do through the National Construction Code, the 7-star that you've related to, going back to what can we do to actually improve existing buildings. And our recommendations were to focus on homes that are rented, and then, of course, the social housing and Aboriginal community housing.
Thanks, Maria. So I'll go to a question from Leslie Corkill, and the question is, what will the process be for the government to respond to the findings? So I'll take that question. So we know under our legislation, essentially, that the government is required to respond to the report within the next 6 months. So we sort of know that there is a timeline for that horizon, and that our legislation sort of goes over that they need to respond and sort of say whether our findings are adopted or not, and outline reasons why not, if they are not adopted. So we know that we can expect that later this year. And yeah, I guess it's something that we will continue monitoring in general. We've offered briefings to many of the relevant government agencies, and we also sort of worked with them in the process of developing our findings in many instances as well. So we look forward to spending time talking through the findings with them and assisting them where we can in formulating the government's response. And I should just clarify for accuracy purposes, it is the Minister for Climate Change who is required by the Act to respond, not the whole New South Wales government or all the other ministers. So our recommendations are relevant to many other ministers and portfolios, but it is the Minister for Climate Change who's required to respond. One of the other questions that we've received is about water, and I might ask this one to you, Andy. The question is, could you speak to how interactions between water availability, water-sensitive urban design, and green infrastructure influence heat stress outcomes in cities, and what this means for the role of the water sector under a hotter climate?
What a straightforward question. So, water-sensitive urban design and green infrastructure helps cool cities most of the time. The cooling of the city by, for instance, green infrastructure is achieved by evaporation, which adds to the humidity in the atmosphere. Now, if you imagine a typical heat wave, for instance, we saw this summer, there was plenty of water around, there wasn't a problem. But if you have a really serious heat wave, one lasting tens of days, the ability of the landscape to evaporate is usually deeply suppressed. And because it's dark, it tends to absorb more solar radiation. I think there is evidence that under extreme conditions, unless you can maintain the supply of water to a water-sensitive and green infrastructure, you might have counterintuitive effects. The problem is this has not been extensively researched, and we don't know to what degree this operates at scale. So I think in terms of comfort in cities, the green infrastructure is awesome. But as a means to cope with truly extreme heat waves, I think it's a work in progress to determine to what degree it would work.
And I might jump in, Andy. I mean, this is specific for green roofs as well. You know, we see that green roofs in thriving environments where there is either natural water or good water support for them, but we also found in Central West the green roofs without the water don't work. So it's what is appropriate locally as well, based on the need for assurance of water for those plants. So it just adds another element of risk and opportunity for the planning.
I can also just mention on the water sector, I've seen some of the adaptation plans by Sydney Water, and they are best practice. We've also did work for Sydney Water, and it's mostly about supply, not about demand. So if you think of the Sydney catchment, really what matters most of all is how many East Coast flows sit over the Warragamba catchment for periods of a few days each year. The rest is almost a detail. So one of the things we desperately want to know is how climate will influence East Coast flows. And there are papers now published on that, but it's certainly a work in progress and we're not sure what will happen.
Thanks for that, Andy. And yeah, I'll just add that water did come up quite a bit when we're in Western New South Wales. It's obviously a big issue out there, and it's a really important enabler for communities to cool down. So certainly in a lot of parts of New South Wales, which are dry, I guess extreme heat risks are exacerbated in those places, and I think it will continue to be a big issue. So going to some of the other questions, I might take this one in the first instance, but I'll throw to you, Maria, in case you've got anything to add. So the question's from Emma Bacon, and it is, New South Wales is about to begin consultation on whether there should be minimum energy efficiency standards for rentals. The findings in the report align with supporting new standards. Will the Commission or Commissioners be making a submission to the consultation when it opens? So my first attempt at answering that is that we'll have to make that decision as a commission. So the commissioners will have to make that decision as a commission about whether we make a submission to that consultation. But I guess this report does make our position quite clear. I will throw to Maria if you've got anything to add about minimum energy efficiency standards for rentals.
I think you've answered it beautifully in that we do consider whether outside of our cycles we make responses like we did for the data centre review. So the minimum energy standards for buildings is also having enough information so people can make a decision about what it's going to be like to live in that property. And what is it going to cost to live in that property? And so we've been advocates and supporters for mandatory disclosure of information that helps with those decisions. As Andy pointed out, we play on the mitigation side, so let's reduce emissions and energy efficiency being key to that. On this side, though, we're squarely sitting on the adaptation side, which is we have extreme heat risks increasing. Our buildings are not fit for purpose. Our weather data that we use to design and predict the performance of buildings is not in line with the projections of future climate, nor with today's current climate. And so we've been advocating for a lot more work to be done in relation to efficiency, to comfort, but now we've introduced the thermal safety and the thermal resilience as an adaptation measure.
Thanks, Maria. I'll move to one more question before we wrap up, and I'll, in the first instance, try to answer this question. It's from Sybil Day at the Sydney Children's Hospital Network, and the question is, how will the Commission engage with New South Wales Health, including mental health, so that 1, health service planning for increased mental health emergencies and hospitalisations is included in heat planning? 2, mental ill health is included in heat health promotion at scale, given the potential for preventing acute mental health emergencies and suicidality. So we will be offering briefings to New South Wales Health. We have, and we've been talking to officers there. So we engage with all agencies, I guess, across New South Wales government where it's relevant to our work. And we do see ourselves as a key partner and them as a key partner to our work. So there is that collaborative spirit to the way that we work with government agencies, even though we are an independent advisor. So we'll continue to engage with New South Wales Health in that way. I think in terms of our report recommendations about health service planning, I think, you know, we don't distinguish between, I guess, physical and mental health. We mention psychosocial impacts of extreme heat in our report. And I think that the forward planning nature of some of the first findings in the report does include or should include in the way that they are interpreted mental health as in addition to physical health episodes. So I don't think we've said anywhere that we're not including mental health, and we know and we've heard through our consultation the impact that extreme heat does have on mental health. It impacts social isolation as well, and it is a broader impact at scale that we'll continue to find out more on about. Is there anything you'd like to add, Andy or Maria, to that response?
No, I don't think so, Louisa.
Okay, great. So I will go to wrapping up. We're almost at time. So thank you so much for joining us today. Please don't hesitate to get in touch. We have our contact mailbox just there on the slide. So contact@netsarocommission.newsouthwales.gov.au. Please get in touch if you've got any further questions to that mailbox, and we'll work on coming back to you. As I mentioned earlier, this isn't the end of our work on heat stress. We'll be briefing relevant government agencies on the findings over the coming months, and we'll await the government's response within the next 6 months. And we'll continue monitoring this space as a focus area. And we'll be working to integrate our findings into the Commission's broader monitoring approach to look at how we monitor progress towards the adaptation objective in New South Wales, which is that New South Wales should become more resilient to a changing climate. So that concludes our webinar today. Thank you all for attending.